Coming up on Dialogue Weekend. On Friday, China wrapped up an important planning meeting on economic work for the coming year. What are the focuses for 2021? The USCC, a congressional advisory body, has published a 575-page report outlining strategic competition between China and the United States in various fields. How do they view the China-U.S. relationship? And this week's Newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Jinduo. China's top leadership has wrapped up the 3-day annual Central Economic Work Conference, setting the course of the world's second-largest economy for next year. And what are the priorities, with 2021 marking the beginning of China's new 5-year plan period? How will the country carry out its reforms on both the supply and demand sides? And what are the challenges in expanding consumption and investment? To learn more, we are joined in the studio by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and via Skype by Ju Jiandong, Unigroup Chair Professor at PBC School of Finance at Tsinghua University, and via satellite by Martin CF, Senior Fellow from the Global Policy Institute. Welcome to the show. John, I will start with you in the studio here. So, there's a quite long statement after the meeting, what are the tasks and what are the goals for next year. So what impressed you the most? Is there anything, surprising you or out of your expectation?
I think the first task really surprised, well, not surprising me actually. I think the first task is the most important one. Mm-hmm. This is a economic work conference, but the first task is actually not so much about economics, right? It's not so much about financial markets. It's actually about technology development, strategic technology development. And I think, this tells a lot about the central government's focus in the context of this big competition. I call this the great competition between the United States and China, primarily in areas of technology and innovation. Yeah. So I think this is the most important thing coming from this conference.
Yeah, Jiandong, since you are also based in China, do you have a similar impression? Like, there's very much emphasis on this innovation, technology innovation, and also the ensuring the control of supply chain, etc.
Well, you probably view this conference as probably the first. As I can see, the conference view China as the independent, probably the largest economy in the world, going to the recovery period. So if you view in this way, I mean you can see everything actually just like the one of the largest economy, how we should treat that. Mm-hmm. Of course, we needed to have the innovation. We have to pay much more attention on the domestic consumptions. But that is always the largest economy should do.
Mm-hmm. Well, Martin, from DC, how do you see this outcome of this conference?
I agree with the assessments we've just heard. I think one should add to this, China, the United States, the whole world economy is going to be in a recovery mode, obviously, and the prospects for this with the new vaccines coming on market are ultimately going to be very good, but it will take several months for this to take effect. And therefore, I think we have bright prospects for the coming year, but they will be brighter later in the year rather than earlier in the year. One of the main problems, or challenges rather, we will see is in the United States there may be a brief surge of optimism when Biden gets in, economically in terms of Wall Street and investment, but that may fade a little when people realize that the economy will take a little while still to rebound. But I think the emphasis on innovation is extremely valuable, especially so for China, because it's not just innovation, it's innovation in a period of recovery, which gives you an opportunity for restructuring and increased emphasis on innovation. And the great strength of the Chinese economy is the great focused resources which can be rapidly directed into growth areas. And in the United States right now, with so many distractions, I don't think we're as effective that way. So between the emphasis on pumping more domestic demand into the Chinese economy and the switch to innovation, I think strategically these are very well-placed priorities.
Mm-hmm. Well, go back to Jiandong, picking up on what you have said about, if you view this economic conference under, economic recovery, and then there's some insight over there. So how do you see this, like, 8 tasks listed out by the conference for next year? The priorities. What are the true priorities for you for next year?
Well, as I said, if we view, it's kind of different. China, it's the only major economy has already have the positive growth, and for the rest of the world, like the U.S. and Europe, there may be a problem for the vaccine, maybe a problem for the COVID-19. Still not sure. Still highly uncertain what would happen in next year for the economy. But for China, definitely it's going to recover. So that's the first. China is different from the world. So it's very good news for the rest of the world, because usually if we see 2 major engines, if we see the engine U.S. economy or China the economy go well, then the world economy will go well. Now the good news is at least one engine will go to the normal. That's the first. Second of all, if we wanted to see this China, this engine as go to normal, China finally understand China is one of the independent largest economy in the world. Just like the U.S., if we understand it is the largest, one of the largest independent economy in the world, then the first important thing is consumption. You need a consumption, domestic consumption, to move up, to push the economy. That's number one. Number two is innovation. We need innovation to motivate the economy, go to the more dynamic growth, the more dynamic industries. So if you ask me, consumption and innovation will be 2 most important priorities for China next year.
Mm-hmm. Well, Martin, innovation and also in the attempt to ensure the supply chain for China, it is also critically important. The documents also mentioned about, in the short period of time, need to solve this problem. They call it bottleneck technology. For example, like semiconductors. Trump government has been cutting off the supply of chip over there with, to a series of Chinese companies. That will actually slow down the innovation or the growth of the Chinese tech sector, let's say, for the next year.
Well, in the short term it will, but in the longer term it will be an enormous boon to China, because it will motivate demand for China to expand in these specific areas. If we look at the economic sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia in 2014, they were vicious, swinging sanctions. There was considerable concern in Russia that the U.S. Senate and Congress were even then waging economic war against Russia. But the sanctions backfired, especially in the food processing sectors of the Russian economy and primary agriculture. The Russian economy has never been better. It's looking better in those areas than it has looked at least in a century, probably ever. They backfired because they stimulated the domestic Russian economy and opened up new areas of demand for it without realizing it. With the semiconductor moves against China, we will see the same thing here. What American economic planners and pundits do not realize is not just the power but the flexibility of the Chinese economy. I think many Chinese experts themselves are not fully aware of their own flexibility here. The model here, in fact, is the United States 50, 70, 80 years ago when it was recovering from the Great Depression. When you have the largest primary industrial base in the world, which China now does, this automatically gives you a capability, not instantly of course, but in a matter of only a year or two, and sometimes even in a matter of months, to expand critical areas when the opportunity is there for it. The United States is actually helping develop high-tech in China while thinking it is waging war against it. So I think there's great opportunity and flexibility here, opening up for Chinese manufacturers in these key high-tech areas.
Well, another thing rather new, actually, John, mentioned in the document is about the effort, the anti-monopoly efforts, to prevent this so-called disorderly expansion of capitalism. Explain to us why it's necessary to fight against monopoly or potential monopoly, why we should prevent this, wild expansion of capitalism here.
I think this is against the backdrop of the recent developments in the online e-commerce area. We have a couple of companies that have been expanding very rapidly, not just in scale, but also in scope, getting into tangential businesses and, in a sense, destroying jobs but also taking business away from other companies. And I think there's an overall societal concern that these companies have become too big, too large, and as basically, in my view, they are essentially building a digital national infrastructure. And of course, from a regulator's perspective, there's a concern that such a large-scale national digital infrastructure that is in the hands of few private companies. This is something that, of course, is a concern from the national economic security perspective. So I think that's what's coming from, and we do have the kind of tools, not just I won't say to control these companies, but at least to regulate these companies. Yeah, to regulate these companies. That is the anti-monopoly law. That is the anti-unfair competition law. A slew of other tools that the government can use. And I think some of the acts and behaviors by some very large companies are really subject to be debated, very controversial. I want to emphasize the point that getting into a monopoly position itself or a very large market share, in our jargon, antitrust jargon, is called dominant market position. Getting into that position is by itself, per se, is not illegal. No. It's the abuses of those positions that are questionable. Anti-monopoly law, exactly. Article 17 here in China stipulates several kinds of abuses of dominance behaviors. And I can easily come up with a couple of behaviors that can fit that definition.
Need to be regulated.
They need to be regulated. I just give you one example. One of the largest companies in China, they have this policy of forcing the stores, the manufacturers, the brand owners on their platform to be exclusively dealing with them. That's questionable. It's called exclusive dealing, right? So these are the things that the government should take a look at this. And I think on one side, these large companies do improve efficiency of the economy. But on the other hand,
we have reached the stage probably to do something.
We have reached it's a damage to competition that's at stake here. For a long time, these industries are very dynamic, and we tend to protect them because they're the future industries. They have this argument called dynamic competition. You have to be very careful about regulating these industries. But now, after all these years, they have reached enormous scale, and I think that argument doesn't hold anymore.
Well, thank you. Let's leave it there for now and take a look at related issue. Actually, we mentioned about the China-U.S. relations. Recently the Congressional Advisory Body, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, published a nearly 600-page report focusing on what it calls China's global contest with the U.S. for power and influence. What does the report tell us about the U.S. perceptions of its relations with China, and how much impact will it have on the U.S. policymakers? Again, in this part, we are joined by Professor John Gong and Martin CF. Welcome back, Martin and John here. John, this report, it actually says that, mentioned about global competition. Says like China is engaged in a global competition for power and influence with the U.S. and calls China an unprecedented economic rival and a growing military threat. What's your take on that? Do you accept that conclusion?
I think this report is talking about China's growing influence in many countries, as if China is deliberately seeking influence. But the fact matter is that influence or other countries' perception of China, we have another term called the country brand, or some people call it soft power. These things, I think, are not so much really driven by government actions. It's deeply embedded in the products and services that companies sell around the world. Think about American influence, right? The American influence, where does it come from? Not so much come from the American government, but mostly from the products that are being sold in Coca-Cola, in McDonald's, for example, right?
Hollywood movies.
In the Hollywood cultural goods, Hollywood movies. Those things are really implying bringing the influence around the world. And it's such a good thing, right? As China's economy is rising to be the second largest economy in the world, I think my friend Xu Jiandong is saying the largest economy by PPP calculation. But that's fine. China is the largest exporting country in the world right now. Of course, there's going to be influence embedded in these goods and services we sell around the world, right? And I think this is a very benign motive behind it. We just want to sell stuff, So I think it's quite natural that with more trade between China and the rest of the world, with more tourists from China visiting many parts of the world, with Chinese investment going to many countries, this kind of influence is going to be coming. It's going to be increasing no matter what.
So it's a natural byproduct.
It's a natural byproduct, right? So what's about it? I mean, what's the big deal here, right?
Exactly.
You can't stop Chinese goods from leaving China into other countries. So I think this report authors they're climbing up the wrong tree. They're trying to stop that trend. It's impossible.
Martin, the year 2020, of course, witnessed this rapid, I would say, deterioration between the countries, China and the U.S., their relationship over there. So do you see this year's report somehow different from the one of last year?
Yes, but only unfortunately in intensifying the negative trends. And I fully agree with the professor in his analysis that this is barking up the wrong tree. And it is also like swimming up the Yangtze River or swimming up Niagara Falls or the Mississippi in the U.S., going against the current, doing something that is unnecessary and unwise and a waste of energy and is impossible anyway. Because just as U.S. cultural influence and over the last 70 years has largely been positive and benign, the same is vastly true of China's peaceful economic and industrial growth, which is certainly going to continue. And as we discussed in the previous segment, the world needs China's economic engine to raise its prosperity in general and to recover from the economic crisis of the pandemic in particular. So I do not like this new analysis. I think it is wrongly conceptualized, and again it is trying to do the impossible. It is the world benefits when the US and China play to each other's strengths and interact positively economically. China and the US have developed enormous benefits this way over the last 30 and 40 years and should continue to do so.
Well, looking into the future, I think there are some people, at least from the U.S. side, there's a concern that, whether China is going to somehow surpass the U.S. or overtaking the U.S. Dominant position globally.
Yes.
So, the report argues that China and the U.S. engage in a systematic struggle over the future of the world order. So, Martin, do you think people accept somehow, you have the equal power, the U.S. has a peer in China, maybe in 10 years or in 20 years? So what kind of a global structure we are going to have? Bipolar?
Oh, I think it is necessary to be multipolar rather than bipolar, because you still have Russia, you have the European Union, which is going through a crisis now, and I think we will see major restructuring politically and economically in Europe, but Europe as a major constructive region will still be there. People never talk about the rise of the major Latin American economies, Brazil, Argentina, Chile too, Mexico. Mexico is going to be one of the top 10 economies in the world and is growing rapidly. It's very underestimated. India. So it's a multipolar world. And I think in the U.S., American geopolitical thinkers do not have the flexibility that American industry and business has always been rightly famous for. There's a certain ponderousness over the past 120 years to U.S. policy making. In the 19th century, they were obsessed with the British Empire. In the 20th century, first they were obsessed with Germany in both world wars, and then with the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It's as if they are most comfortable in a bipolar confrontational setting, and they now want to put China into the bad guy's seat, like in some old obsolete Western movie. And that is not the way they should be approaching the world. It is very unrealistic. And it generates an unnecessary suspicion and fear and hostility of China, which is not warranted by China's record.
Well, briefly, John, if you look at the Chinese, not the exact response, but you see the remarks and statement from the government. For example, Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a speech, a video clip, basically speaking to the Asia society. He actually called for more cooperation, called for return to the right track of this bilateral relationship, when there is a new government in Biden. Right. What do you think of that?
I think there's a conspiracy on the part of the Trump administration, especially in the State Department headed by Mike Pompeo, to basically stir up fear and basically tries to bait China into kind of an escalation of tensions during the last few weeks of this failing administration. And I think China's response is measured and also quite restrained, not to be entrapped in this conspiracy. And I think it's a good thing that we didn't escalate. We still try to cultivate a cooperative, even a competitive relationship with the United States. So I would say let's just be patient. Let's just weather through this few more weeks. This administration is going to be gone. They're voted out of the office by the American people, and Mike Pompeo is also going to be gone. So we'll have a new administration with a new State Department. And I think their efforts to basically box in America's China policy is not going to have a long-lasting effect. It may last a few more months, but I think eventually, both countries' relationship be back to course.
Back on track, hopefully, in the less than a month time. Well, with that, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, in this part of our discussion, I'm joined by Zhou Rui, chairman of the Bridge Tank. So, Zhou, the first question, when you heard of the news of the president catching the virus, what's your response?
Well, first of all, it's always good to be on CGTN, and thank you for this time playing a very nice French music. I'll get back to your question on President Macron, but I just overheard your previous speaker saying that Europe is in a crisis. I think it's related to Mr. Macron. I'm surprised to hear that Europe is in a crisis. We're always in a crisis if we listen to foreign commentators. Well, even with the Brexit, the EU 27 is the largest GDP in the world, not just by purchasing power parity. It is the single largest GDP in the world. We've had, and it's a historic move, we've voted a 7-year joint budget stimulus package. We have 7 years visibility, and our stimulus package is the greenest in the world. So I don't see there's a crisis. Sorry for answering on that first, but that links me to your question on President Macron. Well, the President of France has COVID, like millions of people have had it over the world. That hasn't changed the functioning of the French system. That has not altered issues of coordination between France and the German presidency, especially in terms of negotiation, which are very crucial these days, at a crucial phase. The EU and France takes an active part in that, are negotiating a possible agreement on investment with China. I would say that President Macron is like any patient of COVID of his age. Well, he's a bit tired, but he's not under risk. So COVID is really not a personal issue. It's a collective issue. It's a pandemic issue. The president has always known that. Well, he still knows that. It's just had fever.
Well said. It's not a personal issue. It's a collective issue. President Macron said that his infection shows that the virus really can touch everyone because he's
Yes.
Well protected and has been very careful. Still, you somehow got infected. So, will his message sound alarm for the public, the French public, in a time of festivity, Christmas and the New Year?
Well, I'm not sure it's about alarm, but pedagogy is about repeating, and again repeating. We've known since the beginning. I think that, in any crisis, there's an opportunity. Opportunity, it's a Chinese saying, after all. You know that better than I know. But in this, the COVID is a pandemic. It's a terrible pandemic. But this had already, for many months, recalled the developed economies, the emerging economies, the advanced economies, that a pandemic is not just something that might happen in developing countries in Asia or in Africa, that this can happen to everyone. We've already seen that different people in the well-off parts of the society can catch it as well. We know there is an inequality. We know in the US, partly in Europe, that the poorest are more exposed to that, but we knew already that everyone can catch it. So I think it's about really understanding what are the barrier gestures. Barrier gestures can't have a single minute of hesitation or forgiveness with yourself.
Well, Joe,
I'll give. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm wondering, the priority, obviously, for almost every country now is the control of the pandemic, and European Union is to start this vaccination process. My understanding is like a Monday, 21st. So hopefully, the French public will also be ready to receive the shot. But there's a Ipsos survey showing that only 54% of the French adults ready or willing to get the shot when the vaccine arrives. Is that a concern?
Well, I would say this poll is even maybe optimistic. The reality might be less. There's a clear map at the global level where the developed economies have less trust on that and the developing economies have more trust on the vaccine. I think the reason is very simple. As I said, those kind of epidemics, those kind of disease were usually more found in developing economies. So there's a kind of cultural, civilizational accustomation, use to that. So for the so-called West, for the so-called developed countries, it's pretty new. So I think it's more a matter of time. I think those polls will change very fast.
Sorry, our time is running out, Joy. With that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thanks for watching. See you next week.